China lays the seeds for the greatest economic transformation in the history of human civilization. Today on History Mondays. Alright guys, the flannel is back and so are we. Welcome to part 3 in our history of China. Today we're talking about a Chinese leader that many people who don't know much about Chinese history don't really know about, but who should. I would argue this man is at least as equally important to the development of contemporary China as Mao Zedong, and that man is Deng Xiaoping. What we're talking about today is the period around 1978, 1979, all the way up until the mid-90s. Basically, this period is a period of economic reformation led by Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China. Now, before we get into all of these specific reforms, what I want you guys to take away from this episode, what I want you, yes you, what I want you to know about this episode is this. Before Deng Xiaoping came to power, when China was under the leadership of Mao Zedong, the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy, that is, their credibility as a ruling party, came from their ideology. It came from their ideological commitment to communism as being the vanguard of the communist movement. That gave them legitimacy and credibility in the eyes of the Chinese citizen, and that's what the Chinese Communist Party wanted. They wanted their legitimacy to come from their communist ideology. When Deng Xiaoping comes into power, he transitions this legitimacy from communist ideology to economic progress. What does this mean? Basically, since the late 1970s all the way until the present day, the legitimacy of the Communist Party of China does not come from their communist ideology, but their ability to provide economic progress, economic growth, economic prosperity to the Chinese people. That is what I want you guys to understand. The legitimacy of the Communist Party of China from the late 1970s until today is based on their ability to provide economic prosperity to the Chinese people. If they stop providing economic prosperity, they're going to have a whole lot of issues, a whole lot of domestic turmoil, which they kind of already have. Alright guys, so Deng Xiaoping takes power, and with the help of some liberally minded reformers, starts to institute some economic reforms into China. Now there's a whole host of economic reforms. I'll only mention a few of these in sort of broad terms. The first one is in the agricultural section. Remember back to last episode, I talked about the mass movement of collectivization. Deng Xiaoping comes into power and says we are going to decentralize these peasant communes, or we're going to give private plots of land on the communes to individual peasants, and as long as they meet a bottom line state quota, anything that they produce or make over that quota, they can either keep or sell on the private market. And this unleashes a wave of ingenuity, of entrepreneurship, and prosperity in the agricultural and peasant community. Deng also creates space for private businesses in Chinese society, and they start kind of small, but they eventually grow into medium and even larger size companies. And this is because Deng allows, to a small or an even medium extent, some market mechanisms to take root in China. Obviously not to a great extent. Even under Deng there's centralized power in state-owned enterprises, but he does start to allow more and more room for small and medium-sized businesses to operate, and even larger-sized businesses eventually. So you've got agricultural reform, you've got the opening up to private businesses. You also have an emphasis that's placed on foreign direct investment. Overseas foreign firms and governments pouring money into the Chinese market. Basically, Deng lifts the curtain away from China and says, look, we are encouraging finance from the outside world to come into China. And boy, does it come. Now, most of this foreign investment, foreign capital that's flowing into China finds its way to the specific special economic zones that Deng and the government set up in particular places around China. And they say in these zones, places like Shanghai and coastal regions, in these zones, we're going to limit the amount of government regulation and government intervention in order to encourage foreign direct investment. And it's not just money and capital that comes in, but it's also expertise. And one of the experts who comes into the country is none other than Henry Paulson Jr., who was the former Secretary of Treasury of the United States of America under George W. Bush and was the former CEO of Goldman Sachs. Now, finally, the last reform that I will mention here, and there are many other reforms that took place, was the decentralization of power from the central Communist communist government in Beijing to provincial and local governments. And what this ended up doing, or what this precipitated, is more experimentation with governance and policies at the local and provincial levels, i.e. decentralizing the power, let individual governors, individual leaders of towns make decisions about how they would want their region to operate. They could do this, they could do that. Different regions would make different policies, and they could come up with the best policies, the best decisions for their specific regions. And this created much more of a prosperous society in lieu of the sluggish, slow-moving, bureaucratic, centralized governments. Now, these economic reforms basically catapulted China into levels of incredible economic growth. I mean, you're talking about 10%, 11%, 12% annual growth. And the economic transformation of China from 1980 to 2010 is nothing short of astounding. I mean, it's because of these economic transformations and reformations that Deng Xiaoping and his reformers instituted into society. However, come 1988, 1989, some of the inequality that has been resulted and some of the prosperity that has been instituted into Chinese society has moved, particularly the students, to start demanding more political participation in the Chinese system. Now, there's a lot of other factors that pushed the students into sort of the protesting that we saw in Tiananmen Square in 1989, but a lot of it had to do with the prosperity and the economic reforms that were being unleashed into China as people get richer, as inequality increases, as technology, as jobs, as the workplace transforms and old training systems and old jobs become obsolete. There's a lot of room for angst, for political angst. And the way this manifested in China was the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. Long story short, the Communist Party saw these protests as a direct threat to their singular party hold on power, and they took drastic steps to end it. They called in the People's Liberation Army, and the People's Liberation Army basically rolled in a bunch of tanks. You've all seen the famous picture of the tank man, the singular man who's standing in front of a column of tanks. PLA ran right through the Tiananmen Square protesters. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people were killed. Immediately after the protests were ended, there were mass arrests, mass incarcerations, torture, a closing off to the outside world, because even though the Communist Party was willing to institute these economic reforms, understand this: the Communist Party in China will never, never, ever, ever, never, never relinquish the single-party state. That is, they want a system that's only one party, the Communist Party. And even until today, they will make any transformation they can short of instituting multi-party democratic rule. The only problem is we'll see in future episodes, some of the reformations, some of the things that need to change in China require, or might require political reformation to a multi-party state. That's it for today, guys. I want you guys to realize, to understand, to remember Deng Xiaoping and the economic reforms. And if you take one thing away, it's that the legitimacy of the Communist Party is in its ability to produce economic growth and to provide economic prosperity for the Chinese people. What do you think about Deng Xiaoping? What do you think about these economic reforms and about staking legitimacy not on communism but on economics? Comment below, let me know, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and remember, like Deng, reality always trumps ideology.